Basically, it's due to their damaged self. It's due to their void of a true balanced self, a true identity. And this is because it has been abused out of them, or beaten, or neglected, or puffed up out of them, okay? They have deep-seated shame and deep-seated guilt that comes from childhood. And with this deep-seated shame and deep-seated guilt, to avoid the pain of this intrinsic feeling and emotion within them, they have to appear perfect. They have to appear superior at all times. And this relieves them. It's this very childlike, very juvenile behavior, but even grown adults will practice this to the point where they just can't admit when they do wrong, or if they make a mistake, they have to make an excuse or blame others. And it's all to avoid that deep-seated shame and guilt that they've been pretty much indoctrinated with since they were very, very young, sometimes even as young as infants. And this is usually where it starts. So they refuse to admit flaw, because not only will these assume one is imperfect, but it will also force them to accept disapproval of others. So if I admit that I did something wrong, while I'm admitting that, I'm also accepting the fact that you disapprove of me. But if I do not admit that I did wrong, if I blame it on someone else, it's not my fault. That way you can't disapprove of me. I've done nothing to be disapproved of. Therefore, it saves me from that feeling of disapproval, which is painful, which reminds me of how I might have felt as a child, or if I might have felt as a young teen. If I were in some type of abusive relationship or lived an abusive childhood, I wouldn't be able to readily apologize or admit flaw, or admit fault, or admit wrong. Basically, they cannot make mistakes. There's no mistake that they allow themselves to at least admit to. They're human beings. They make mistakes all the time like anyone else, but they don't allow themselves to admit it. It's a way to save face. That way, if they never make mistakes, at least if they make the appearance, or if they make it seem as if they don't make mistakes by not admitting to them, this means that there's no disapproval. This means they're always, in their head, they can never be disapproved. They can always be approved of and accepted. And this way they are perfect and they are superior. This is how the distortion works within the mind of the narcissist. So what are some other narcissistic signs and traits of this disorder? Well, it's important to pay attention to this here. To be considered pathological, or to be suffering from the disorder, their behaviors must be independently expressed outside of the cultural or social context. Basically independent of cultural influence. So for instance, today, this day and age, women, men that are very vain, okay, or that are very driven by narcissistic things like acquisition of money, different types of fashion and false value, vanity, basically. Very aggressively arrogant, pushy, demanding, inconsiderate, these types of things. These are all narcissistic behaviors, but these are all actually promoted in our culture. These are very normalized things and even rewarded behaviors in our culture. So people who would behave this way regularly and openly would not really fit for a type of diagnosis per se, unless there was enough of these patterns set in a way that would create a pathology. We can't just see, oh, they're always on their phone, they take 100 pictures of themselves every day, they're liars, they're cheaters, they're suffering from MPD. We can't go that route. So before we get into the types, the two specific types of narcissists, let's talk about some more traits. Clear one is seeking admiration. So they seek admiration almost as if it were a drug. This is part of narcissistic supply. Narcissistic supply is a type of attention or value that narcissists get from other people, usually by way of attention, by way of admiration, and sometimes by way of causing pain to others. This is when you get into the more sadomasochistic or masochistic type, the psychopathic type of narcissist. But just in general, a narcissistic trait is to seek admiration at all times, not just sometimes, not just when you're feeling down, but at all times. This is the difference between just a normal narcissistic person who just seeks attention like most people on IG, or an actual narcissist who is, by way of nature and every step, move, thought that they take or make or have, are seeking admiration and acceptance and worship. In fact, they seek worship. They rather show off than have substance. This is another big thing. So they tend to be liars. They tend to exaggerate things constantly and appear as if they are more than they truly are. And they are shallow, yet they aim to appear deep. This is usually what we will see, with full-on dishonesty and deception in ways that are pretty dark. For instance, like plagiarism, things like this, like stealing identities, this depth of antisocial type of behaviors you'll find that are just readily available for narcissists. They don't think about these things even being wrong because, in a sense, they make their own morality. Of course, pathological lying is a clear sign. They cannot be honest. In fact, that's another thing. Narcissists cannot be honest in the true sense of the word. It's not that they can never tell the truth, but they cannot be honest people. It's not in them. They lack integrity, and they exaggerate pretty much everything. And it's not that normal people don't do these things. Normal people tell lies. Normal people exaggerate things. Normal people have difficulty being honest in certain situations, but the narcissist lives a life of this type of behavior. Of course, they are very impatient. The narcissistic trait is impatience. They are extremely impatient. They are easily bored because they're constantly in need of consuming. This need of consumption, this need of consuming narcissistic supply makes them very easily bored, and they're quick to anger. Another narcissistic trait is an immediacy of anger. When anger is right below the surface to where they can just be set off by simple things, whether it be a word, a statement, or even a look, a certain facial expression can tip someone off and trigger them. But this quick anger, that is also a narcissistic trait. Narcissism is pathological, especially the true, authentic type, the classical, authentic narcissist. They cannot be cured, and there is no form of therapy that has ever worked. The only thing I believe that can cure a narcissist is Christ. Very rarely do narcissists believe in any type of spiritual worldview, and those that do, because there are Christian narcissists out there, you better believe it, those that do are not in the Holy Spirit. They're actually under the spirit of Jezebel and these types of things. So impatient, easily bored, quick to anger. These are all very clear telltale signs of the narcissist. Now, all of these things that we're talking about here are carried out by an individual. This is a way that you can easily see for yourself that this person is suffering from some type of abnormal narcissistic dis-ease. So aside from quick to anger is omnipotence and omniscience. So they believe they are all powerful, and they believe they are all knowing in many cases. This is why they utilize gaslighting, because they want to seem like they know everything. So to make others think that they know everything, they use gaslighting to manipulate others into believing anything and everything that they say. And omnipotent meaning they're overpowering to the point where they're stronger, and not necessarily physically, but they have more power and say so than anyone. And we're going to get into why this is right now. So next I want to get into this idea of two main types of narcissists. Now there's subtypes that go under these two main types. That usually just has to do with personality type. All the subtypes have to do with personality type, culture, and more character things, character flaws. But overall, there really are only two types of narcissists, and they break down into these two categories here: overt or grandiose narcissist, and covert, vulnerable narcissist. And again, these categories and labels, they're all ways to show correlation between different sets of behaviors. So what we notice in psychology and in sociology and in humanity in general is groupings of behaviors. And when you can group behaviors, you can get an understanding of how certain groups work or how they will behave. And what we've noticed over time is that humans tend to group behaviors, and certain behaviors have certain outcomes and certain results. And when you can understand that certain grouped behaviors will have certain results, you can do things to avoid being victim of these things, or at least being aware of people's potential, especially potential for abuse. So by knowing these different grouped behaviors, we can be aware of certain individuals' potential for abuse. And I think this is the area where certain aspects of psychology are helpful for anyone that is on earth. So here's the overt type, the grandiose narcissist. This is the one we're most familiar with. So here we have the classical narcissist. Anytime you hear about narcissism, you're usually going to hear about this type, because the covert type you don't hear about often at all. A great example of the overt grandiose is the mother in Mommy Dearest. great example of the classical. This is the extroverted. We have to look at temperaments. We have temperaments. The most accurate scale of temperaments probably would even go back to Plato's with the 4 temperaments, which are extremely accurate even to this day in regards to the grouped behaviors, group temperaments of humans. We have about 4 different types of temperaments that people are, and sometimes they are a hybrid of 2, but mainly they fit into one group just based on their behaviors, observing their behaviors alone. And these things are also genetically tied as well. So the classical narcissist is an extroverted narcissist, exhibitionist, self-assured, dominant, superior, self-oblivious. Okay, this is one that's really important to know about this type of narcissist. They are self-oblivious. They are blind to the fact that they are unhealthy. They're blind to the fact that they aren't extremely narcissistic and suffering from some type of disorder or disease, and they tend to ignore any ideas of this. That's why they say the narcissist can never be healed, can never be fixed, because they tend to be referring to this type of narcissist, which are the hardest ones to crack and usually never succeed in changing and only dish out pain and despair for all those that come in contact with them. These are the worst type of narcissists to be raised by the way, though all types have their destructive nature. This type tends to make the biggest mess as they interact. Their deep-seated issue, of course, being the self, is fear and insecurity. So though they come across extroverted, exhibitionistic, and dominant, superior, their, in fact, false self was created as this type of powerful, self-assured, braggadocious, omnipotent false self. But actually their void, their true self, is basically non-existent, but based in fear and insecurity, like a small little scared child within them. And so then we'll go into the next, which is, I say, the most significant narcissist, because they are usually undetected. Say the most dangerous. They may not exhibit the most scary behaviors, and they may not make the most damage, but they are the most dangerous because they're usually undetected and they're very clever. By the way, the classical extroverted narcissist is usually very low in intelligence. They're usually not as intelligent. They're usually on the lower end of intelligence and usually can be very naive and basically not very quick in the terms of their brain processes. They're usually very simple, animalistic, caveman-like even, driven by power and control. Now, the covert, vulnerable type narcissist is the absolute opposite. They are actually usually highly intelligent. They are usually more of the cerebral type of narcissist, opposed to the classical narcissist is usually the somatic narcissist, which is more focused on the body, sexuality, appearance, wealth, these types of things. The covert, vulnerable narcissist, I call them the inverted narcissist. They're the introverted temperament type of narcissist, to where they're usually more cerebral, they're usually in higher intelligence, and they are much different in the sense that they are not exhibitionists, they are not self-assured. In fact, they're very anxious, and the inverted narcissist is very neurotic. Extremely anxious, extremely neurotic, and extremely passive-aggressive, opposed to the dominant and outwardly aggressiveness of the superior classical extroverted narcissist. With the inverted introverted temperament, you get this passive aggressiveness to the point where they can even come off extremely soft and almost delicate and meek in many senses, hence their dangerous nature, because they're so hard to detect. And aside from being very bold and arrogant, they are cowardly and extremely envious. Instead of thinking that they are better than others, like the extroverted classical type, the introverted type will not only be extremely cowardly, but feel lower and lesser and weaker than others, and then be extremely envious of others because of that void within them. Now, the interesting thing about the inverted narcissist is they are extremely self-aware. They are so self-aware that they are hyper self-aware, to the point where they are extremely self-conscious. They are so aware of themselves that they become so self-conscious, in many cases asocial, and in the worst cases schizoid, to the point, and even further down to different types of psychopathy and even schizophrenia. So with these types, they tend to be very self-aware. They have more of a chance to come out of their narcissism because of their self-awareness. This is something that the classical extroverted type doesn't really have. Now, is there such thing as a hybrid? I believe so. I haven't necessarily studied one. I haven't been in contact with one, but I do believe it's a possibility just based on how the spirits work, based on the demonology and these things. I'm sure that there could be some type of hybrid, which would be, I would think, extremely dangerous because they have the cunning and self-awareness and genius of the inverted narcissist with the dominance, power, and omnipotent thought process of the extroverted narcissist. That would be a nightmare to deal with.